Welcome, everyone. My name is Peggy Mason, and I have the privilege to welcome you all again to the second in our February 2021 sixth session webinar program on Arctic security, and to briefly introduce our event sponsors before turning things over to today's moderator, Heather Nickel. The North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network, the first of our three sponsors, conducts leading edge research with students, emerging scholars, and Northern stakeholders, rights holders in relation to core Arctic defense and security policy challenges. The second co-sponsor, the Canadian Pugwash Group, of which I am vice chair, is the national affiliate of the Nobel Prize winning Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, which had its birthplace in Pugwash, Nova Scotia. Education on global security, including nuclear and conventional arms control, control of the arms trade, and environmental security is the mandate of the Canadian Pugwash Group through organizing and supporting events such as these. The third co-sponsor, the Rideau Institute, of which I am president, is an independent think tank with a mandate to help revitalize Canada's peacekeeping, diplomatic peacemaking, and peace-building roles in the world through inclusive multilateralism, strengthening the UN capacity for conflict prevention and peaceful conflict resolution, and the progressive enhancement of international law. So those are the three co-sponsors, but with respect to those who are have actually done the work in putting this all together from those sponsors, I want to draw special attention to NADSN postgraduate fellow Jill Barkley, who will be acting as the webinar series rapporteur, just an invaluable person to have for this kind of a sixth series event. I also want to extend special appreciation to Dr. Shannon Nash, the postdoctoral network manager, who has been instrumental in the organization of this webinar series, as has the network lead, Dr. Whitney Lackenbauer. And with those brief introductions, and welcome to you all, those who were here the first session, the keynote, and those who are joining us for the first time, I'm very pleased to turn it over now to our moderator, Heather Nickel, professor in the Department of Geography and director for the study of Canada at Trent University and NADSN coordinator. Heather, you have it over to you.
Well, thank you, Peggy. And I'm delighted to be here today and to welcome our two speakers for this particular panel. Our first speaker, Doug Causey, is the Arctic Fellow of the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center Arctic Initiative. He's also the Global Fellow of the Wilson Center, Professor of Biological Sciences at the University of Alaska Anchorage, and the principal investigator of the DHS, or the Department of Homeland Security's Arctic Domain Awareness Center of Excellence. An ecologist and evolutionary biologist by training, he's authored over 200 publications on the environmental correlates of Arctic climate change. And he and his students are actively conducting research on the Aleutian Islands, the Northern Bering Sea, and Northwestern Greenland. He's published extensively on policy issues related to the Arctic environment, Arctic environmental security, and bioterrorism and public health. So we're very delighted to have Doug with us today. Our second speaker is Wilfred Greaves. Will is an assistant professor of international relations at the University of Victoria. His research examines global security theory and politics with respect to climate change, resource extraction, and Indigenous peoples, Canada's foreign policy and Canada-US relations, and the politics of the Circumpolar Arctic. Professor Greaves is the author of more than 20 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters and has co-edited 2 books, One Arctic, the Arctic Council and Circumpolar Governance and One Arctic and Circumpolar Governance, and Breaking Through, Understanding Sovereignty and Security in the Circumpolar Arctic. His monograph on Arctic security and climate change is forthcoming from the University of Toronto Press. He's a coordinator of the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network and has received research funding from the Department of National Defense, Global Affairs Canada, UVic, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. So welcome to you too, Will. Now we're going to begin, each of our speakers will speak for about 15 minutes each, and then we're going to turn it over shortly after 3:30, 3:40 for a Q&A, and you're all welcome to submit your questions, and we will attempt to have our panelists answer. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the panel over to Doug Causey and ask you to begin.
Thank you, Heather. Good morning from Alaska. I think many of you, actually, I don't know how many time zones we cover, but as we have all experienced, those of us who are interested in working in the Arctic, I'm turning my meeting off, that we are dealing with great news, simultaneous projects and presentations like we're doing here, but we're dealing with so many time zones. I teach a class. It starts at 8:30 my time that has students from Finland that are participating at 7:30 p.m. their time. So welcome you all. So what I want to talk about today is perhaps a different perspective on what climate change, how it's affecting the Arctic. And so I'm going to switch to my presentation right now. And first, the image that you're seeing, this is literally right outside my back door. So I hope you're all jealous. Anchorage is a great place. Okay, what I'm going to talk about today is environmental security. So you can see the context of what I'm going to talk about, as well as Will. Physical changes in the North American Arctic and the Circumpolar Arctic as well. We're going to explore just a little bit some of the interactions among the environment, sovereignty, which is a term I'm going to explain in just a minute, and community resilience, leaving most of that up to Will. And then what are our next steps? Environmental security is it is a very complex area. It involves the interactions of three and sometimes four very large areas. I'm not a political scientist, so I haven't quite come up with the right term. And here's where I'm going to look for Heather and Whitney to help me out in here. But we're going to call sovereignty because it's the best term I can come up with, which encompasses all aspects of things like defense security and other aspects of essentially who owns and who operates the land. All right. Ecology and the environment, that's my background, and the whole complex area of social resilience, community resilience, what we do as people living in the Arctic. And just as an idea to give you what this all means, if we put these three areas together with all their complexities and dimensions, environmental security is the intersection of all of those. So when all of this complex, as you see, is stable, then we can talk, like what often is done, about the nature of interactions. But you all know none of this is stable. Okay, so it is a constantly changing and interacting complex. And so I'm going to talk just briefly about how things in the Arctic are changing and how this is affecting all these other components. And I would be astonished if the people who are listening right now were not aware of not only the changes in the Arctic, but I'm going to be showing very quickly some images and diagrams, which I know that you've seen in one way or the other, but just to give us a background on what is happening with the Arctic. So the next couple of slides are on that, and this right here is from the U.S. National Oceanics and Atmospheric Administration, where a lot of research is being done. And so what this graph is showing you is that first is that the average temperature, the difference between since 2000 and the present, that difference, we call it the anomaly, is changing, it's increasing, and the important thing for all of us is that it is not uniform. It is not a uniform change in the Arctic. And you can see from the graph there that there are places in the Arctic where it's changing quite quickly, and other places where it's not so quick. This is a map of extreme summer warmth, and I just realized I should also explain. I think many of you on the call here are used to seeing these kind of graphic displays. Most people in the lower latitudes are not used to looking at a circumpolar projection, is what it's called. That's the North Pole. This is where most of you live here in Canada. I'm here in Anchorage. We're right here. This is Greenland, and then this is Russia. So for the graph here is showing you how summer temperatures have increased over this period of time, and it is localized. This is sea ice minimum. And here it's a different projection. This is Alaska, this is Canada right here. And so this is showing you both a graphic as well as a chart here that the minimum and the maximum have decreased, and the difference between the two also has increased. I'll explain what this all has relates to. And this is a picture of the distribution of what's called older ice, and you see on the colors right here that the darkest colors is new ice, that was ice that was formed in the previous winter, to what's called old ice, which is older than 5 years. Older ice is thicker ice. Well, where thicker ice is now restricted, and this is just in 20 years, rather than the entire part of the North American Arctic and Greenland. Now it's in a rather narrow limit over the top of Nunavut, Northern Territories, Greenland, and to a much lesser extent, the Alaska coastline. All right, now the next slides I'm going to go through very quickly, but I want you to look at, this is a graphic. This is the Arctic Ocean, Canada, Alaska. Okay. What you're looking at is the vegetation, the difference in distribution of the vegetation, and it's called the NDVI anomaly. But what you're going to see is a graphic, and what you're looking at is the color green. Okay, color green means that there's more vegetation. All right, so this is October 1982. This is October 1992. This is October 2002. This is October 2007, and that is October 2010, and that's where the data stops. But you can see the rapidity of change. And the point that I am going to show you a couple other graphics as well, it is not linear change, but it's accelerating change. This has enormous implications, not only on the natural environment, but the human environment as well. This is for a summary up to last year forest fires. Oh my gosh. And the Canadian Arctic and the North American Arctic, and particularly the Russian Arctic, the increase in wildfires and what's called the flammability index, dried out vegetation, as you can see, has really increased. All right, so that is some environmental change. Let me move just quickly into some of the consequences of this, environmental change in the Arctic. Well, with the ice retreating and it becoming not very thick multi-year ice, but single-year ice, it's now very possible for transits in the Arctic to increase. The Northwest Passage, everyone in Canada, I am sure, is aware of. The blue arrow right here is called the Northern Sea Route, and it is exclusively over the Russian territories. This is not open just yet, but this is what people are looking at, a possible Central Arctic route, maybe even in 10, 15 years. Why this is important is that now there is greater access to the Arctic by people in countries that are not part of the Arctic. Another thing that's happening is that this the loss of ice means that sunlight can get into the Arctic Ocean. The warming temperatures means that you have plant productivity, and that means that there's more fish. Well, we now have, associated with the climate change in the Arctic, we have throughput shipping. We'll talk about that in a minute. More fishing opportunities and a lot more tourism, which means that we have, well, I'll just have you appreciate this ship right here, which is not unusual. There's more people on that ship than are in many Arctic communities in Nunavut, Northwest Territories, on one ship. And one of the things that we were very interested in looking at in the Arctic Domain Awareness Center is what happens if there's an emergency? How do you get all these people off? Where do they go? And if they went somewhere, how would you get them elsewhere? These changes are going to affect subsistence economies, partly because you have a difference in the plants and animals that are there, but also now we have increased competition. These are the named caribou herds, and Canada owns most of them. We have a few, Russia has some large, but caribou are really important from subsistence, to be sure, but they're also a key component in the Arctic environment. Whoops. Darn it. Sorry, I hit the wrong button. All right. With the increased access through the Arctic Ocean for travel, this picture here is showing just one aspect. For example, China, if they can use the Northern Sea Route over Russia, let's let them work the politics out. They suddenly have almost cut the transit time by about 25%. And here we're talking about significant economic advantages of using the northern route as opposed to the route through the Suez Canal. Greater access to the Arctic regions means, as we put it, the bad guys are able to get there a lot easier than they were before. And that we now have an increased possibility, we're starting to see it now, with illicit and criminal activities. And that quote that I have here is not from me by any means, but this is a common quote among the defense security organizations in the U.S., in Canada, and the other Arctic countries. But in particular, the Arctic is North America's unlocked, unguarded, open back door. And so this is a major concern for these agencies. And for those of us who have been involved or worked in the Arctic for as long as I'm sure many of us have, you know what it was like up until about 5 years ago. For most people, the Arctic was that white stuff at the top of the map. Nobody cared. Nobody lived there. It's all these those ill-formed opinions and ideas, and that really structured a lot of the approach to defense security. So as change in the Arctic is happening, that this is allowing increased seasonal activity, which is also impacting the ability of both local, regional, national, and international agencies that are involved in both conservation, management, and regulation. This is bringing Indigenous and First Nation populations under increasing stress, and I am not the person to be talking about that. But I can make some observations as I have here that this is impacting the traditional ways of life. And so, from my colleagues and friends, they are telling me this. This is something I think Will is going to talk more about, but it is a major issue to consider. So, kind of in summary, security must accompany this increased human activity that's possible in the Arctic, and security. And this is under this very broad term of sovereignty, the awareness, the defense, the whole aspect of land ownership, and that it is a matter of collective and individual trust. And I put here in mistrust as well. And my colleague, Randy Key, wanted me to put the bottom picture in there, is that One Nation seems pretty serious about building bases in the Arctic, in stark contrast with those of us in North America. In summary, a rapidly warming Arctic. It allows for increased human activity, which drives the need for higher security in all its aspects, agile law enforcement and awareness, and advanced human safety and resilience. All right. I just gave you a semester's class, and what, did I do that in 10 minutes?
But that was perfect timing. Thank you, Doug. To the minute, I believe.
See, there we go.
Like that. At any rate, thank you very much, Doug. And we'll hold questions. We're going to turn over to Will Greaves right now, and then we will come back in about 15 or 20 minutes for questions.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Heather and Peggy and Doug, for that opening presentation. It's a pleasure to be here, everyone. Hello from Victoria, BC. And I'm happy to share with you some thoughts that I have and I've kind of pulled together from a couple of different projects that I've worked on, focusing on some of the security and political dimensions of the Arctic climate change that Doug has just so helpfully laid out for us. So I'm attempting to share my screen and that's not working. Actually, I might not be able to do that if I don't have hosting privileges. So I don't know, Shannon, if perhaps you could help me out there. But to begin with, just in terms of my comments, I won't repeat the kind of summary of climate impacts that Doug has just outlined, although I normally would start with that. I think it's really important. Thank you. I think it's really important to kind of understand that physical dimension. Let's just go with this. Okay, are you seeing what I'm seeing yet? Is that, no? Now? Yeah, okay, great. So, yes, so I won't repeat the discussion of the physical environmental context, although I think that's vital. I think that's really necessary as a starting point. But as a social scientist, my focus is on connecting the physical realities and the kind of natural scientific knowledge that we have about climate change and climate trends in the Arctic region, which obviously translate into physical impacts of varying sorts on natural and physical systems. But as I said, as a social scientist, my interest is really how those physical impacts affect human communities and affect Arctic societies. So it's those human and social impacts of these Arctic climate trends that I'm particularly focused on and interested in, as of course many other scholars are. I'm not going to go through these in particular detail. They're probably fairly familiar to you. I say this with a significant degree of regret, but we've been talking about these same issues for a long time now. Certainly for the duration of my career as an Arctic social scientist and long preceding that, there has been a fairly concerted focus on the same basket of issues pertaining to the human health, subsistence, and community impacts of Arctic climate change. And as Doug alluded to, but I think it's really very important, is I'll note that many of these impacts are particularly relevant and particularly harmful for Northern Indigenous communities for a variety of reasons. And we could, I'm happy to kind of discuss or answer any questions pertaining to those, but fundamentally because many Indigenous communities are still partly or largely based on subsistence activities from the land. So changes to the land have a very immediate and sometimes a very dramatic impact upon the quality of life, the conditions of food and water availability that those peoples and communities have relied upon. I always think it's worth noting, of course, the particular cultural relevance as well of Arctic climate change, that for cultural and belief systems, entire Indigenous cosmologies, in fact, that are premised upon a particular understanding of the Arctic environment, the changes and the radical transformation of that environment have consequences for those belief systems, for those cosmologies, for people's very sense of self, people's sense of collective and individual identity. And in that respect, there's a particular relevance, of course, for the loss of Arctic sea ice. Sea ice is the linchpin of many Arctic ecosystems, and certainly in northern Canada, and is, of course, also of profound importance towards Inuit people who have had an immemorial relationship with both the land, water, and ice dimensions or components of the Arctic ecosystem. So these physical climate impacts have these human and social impacts. And some scholars, myself among them, have in the kind of post-Cold War Arctic security scholarship really emphasized many of these challenges and changes to the natural environment as posing human security issues, as posing issues that threaten the prospects of survival and well-being for discrete and identifiable groups of people located in the Circumpolar region. And so this idea that Arctic climate change threatens human security in the Arctic is a fairly well-established argument at this point, not universally agreed to, perhaps, but certainly widespread and I think well reflected within the literature on Arctic security these days. There has not, of course, been a kind of commensurate policy uptake or a commensurate political response to the threats and dangers to survival and well-being that many, indeed perhaps most Arctic inhabitants face, but nonetheless it's understood within the academic and kind of broader debates and discourse around the subject. It's well understood, and I would suggest well accepted, that climate change threatens human security in the Arctic. What I'd like to just touch on, though, briefly today, because I think it's a little bit perhaps less common, is to also expand upon this argument of the implications of Arctic climate change for regional security more broadly. So in the post-Cold War Arctic context, some scholars, and I would again include myself among them, have really understood the natural environment, the Arctic environment, as being central to the regional security dynamics in the Arctic writ large, and that this transcends human security issues and really is a basic argument that says the environment is so central to our understanding of what the Arctic is, but also is so central to the ways in which human beings interact and the opportunities, the conditions of possibility that exist in the region, that you really just can't reckon with or understand security in the Arctic without understanding the Arctic environment. And so our colleague Heather Exner-Perot, who I'm sure is known to many of you, has made this argument, I think, very effectively in her 2013 article, in which she argued very clearly that, quote, the Arctic is exceptional in that the environmental sector dominates circumpolar relations. That is to say, for no other region of the world is the environment so central to politics as it is in the Arctic. So building on that, I argue, and what I'll kind of introduce now is this position that interstate relations and conventional security issues, as well as human security issues in the region, are being affected by climate change. And we need to not maintain a human security lens to the exclusion of a somewhat more conventional interstate security lens. And I think what's really important for me about that argument is the assertion that it's not just human security that's threatened by Arctic climate change. It's a phenomenon that also fundamentally affects the security of Arctic states. And so insofar as those Arctic states, as I've already suggested, have not particularly been responsive to the human security arguments about Arctic climate change, perhaps they'll be more responsive to the argument that their own core national and sovereign interests are also being very, very directly, I would suggest, affected and in many cases harmed by anthropogenic climate change in the region. So some researchers and the natural and physical scientists have described the processes of climate change as they're occurring in the Arctic Ocean as Atlantification and Pacification, which refers to the northern intrusion or the northward intrusion and migration of marine species and warm water from the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. So as currents are changing and as water is warming, there are these kind of interrelated processes whereby species are migrating further north in order to follow the more temperate water, which is also now present in the Arctic Ocean as a result of oceanic warming. And so Atlantification and Pacification refers to these natural or physical processes whereby warmer water from more southerly latitudes is now entering into the Arctic Ocean, and thus providing one more of these feedback loops that is accelerating the process of Arctic and global climate change. I suggest that this idea of Atlantification and Pacification can serve as a useful metaphor in the social sciences and particularly, of course, international relations and security studies as well. And I would suggest that Arctic geopolitical and security dynamics are also changing as a result of this environmental or climate change. And that one of the impacts that this is having is the fragmentation of the Arctic, such that it's going to become increasingly difficult for us to discuss and effectively generate policy at a pan-regional Arctic level, that is to say, encompassing the entire circumpolar region, all 8 of the Arctic states, but rather we're going to see a fragmenting effect down to these sub-regional levels of analysis. So within the circumpolar Arctic as an overall holistic region, I think that this metaphorical Atlantification and Pacification of Arctic security is going to break down the security and political dynamics in the region into sub-regions that are really just northern extensions of the security and political dynamics of the Atlantic and Pacific geopolitical regions, respectively. So this argument is informed by this idea of security communities. This map here is taken from a well-known book on the subject by Barry Buzan and Uli Waver. And as you can see here, they've drawn these lines to indicate the different security regions that exist around the world. So rather than having a kind of global or systemic perspective on security, rather recognizing that for most countries and most people in the world, security is not actually determined at the systemic level, but is determined at the regional level. It's determined by how well one country gets along with its immediate neighbors or the more powerful states in its own particular area, and that's the level of analysis and the level of real world politics at which most security decision-making actually occurs. So I kind of extend this broad framework of thinking to the Arctic region. And so to crib from Doug's point about how important it is for us to look at the Arctic from this perspective, you know, the world from the polar view, something that we do very often in these kinds of contexts, this is the holistic, unified Arctic region. This is the level of analysis for Arctic politics, which has been very prevalent in the post-Cold War period, and has found lots of expression in different policies and initiatives, and of course in the work of organizations like the Arctic Council. I think climate change and the fact that climate change is already and will continue to undermine and alter the uniqueness and the holism of the Arctic Ocean region is going to fragment this circumpolar Arctic into subregions at which the real action takes place. So Atlantification and Pacification refers, in my usage, to the fragmentation of the Circumpole into these two broad regions, one centered on the Fennoscandia region of Northern Europe and Northwestern Russia, the other on the Eurasian Arctic, particularly the bulk of the Northern Sea Route, and the Asiatic, Northeastern Asian Arctic. One thing I hasten to add is that as far as Atlantification goes, I think it's actually a bit of a misnomer, because I don't think that in this context of Arctic climate change, we are going to actually have a single Atlantic, quote unquote, Arctic region. Rather, I think the Arctic is actually likely to fragment into three distinct subregions. So both a Northern European and a North American Arctic region, which quite simply, comprise overlapping but distinct sets of political actors, and are also in just numerous and profound ways are different places from each other. They are different demographically, they're different politically and economically and societally. And so the differences that already exist between the Northern European and the Northern American Arctics are really, as climate change accelerates, going to drive a divergence in what the priorities of those regions are, what the needs of those regions are, and the kinds of security threats and challenges that people and polities in those regions are likely to face. So while I say Atlantification and Pacification, I actually argue more precisely that there will be three emerging Arctic security subregions if they don't already exist. And I think there's some evidence to see this process already at work. So in terms of Atlantification, I'll be very brief here. I welcome questions and discussion. I don't want to take up too much time. But I think we can really see some of this Atlantification process at work in the post-2008 and then again in the post-2014 period. This really has to do in large part with the increasing tensions that have emerged between the Russian Federation and the Western Arctic states. Since 2008, this is the period of the somewhat infamous now Russian flag planting at the geographic North Pole. This is also, beg your pardon, this is also certainly accelerated by the Russian invasion and annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the subsequent sanctions that were imposed. And we've seen this increase in Nordic and NATO defense cooperation in response, which quite overtly positions Russia as the antagonist, Russia as the threatening actor. And it's very difficult to have a kind of pan-Arctic regional cooperation in that context without wanting to play into the new Cold War dynamic, because I think that's a really misguided way of framing this rise in Arctic tension. Nonetheless, it's an easy kind of model for the many of the actors in the region to slip back into. I think the Atlantification, and just to note why the North American and Northern European regions diverge, that the transatlantic tensions and the absence of American leadership, or at least effective American leadership, is also part of this story. So this is the post-Iraq War, in some ways the post-1990s, but really the post-2003 gap in foreign and security policy and priorities that has been only severely exacerbated by the last 4 years of the American Trump administration, of course. Pacification, in this context, really refers to the emergence of a strong interest in the Arctic and circumpolar politics by major Asian actors, and the deepening engagement between Russia, which of course is the predominant state in the Eurasian Arctic. It is, of course, the only state with territory in the Eurasian Arctic. But its engagement with these leading Asian actors, notably China, as I think signified by the Yamal natural gas partnership, is really just a different region. It's a region that's operating according to different sets of principles and emergent norms, and certainly different sets of state interests and state priorities in terms of security and politics. It is a far less democratic region. It's a region where the dominant actors are not democracies, in fact. And so there are really important questions here about legal norms and adherence to international law, and also I think about mechanisms for political accountability and responsiveness given their non-democratic nature. And so the upshot of this argument is that against these more optimistic assessments of Arctic exceptionalism and region building in the post-Cold War period, these are institutions of Arctic regional governance, which I think will endure, will be increasingly challenged by the fragmentation of issues into these kind of sub-regional levels. And so theoretically, this reinforces this move towards a more state-centric form of Arctic politics that has been foreshadowed by our colleague Jessica Shadian, amongst others. And it also, I think, sets the stage for increasingly contentious state and sub-state politics within these Arctic regions. So, for instance, between the territorial governments of the state of Alaska and the Canadian and American federal governments, respectively, between the Nordic states and the Sami parliaments, between the county levels of North Norway and Northern Sweden and Northern Finland, and their own national governments, etc. And so the politics of possibilities rather of sub-regional conflict and spillover are present. I don't think this is an argument that says the conflict is any more likely per se in the region. Just that climate change is driving broader political and security changes, which is going to make it less and less possible or useful for us to conceive of and take action at the region, at the level of the region as a whole. I'm going to skip that slide and just jump right here, which is to say that this fragmentation, I think, is underway. As the holism of the region itself is undermined, so too security and politics become less regionalized. This doesn't mean the conflict is inevitable or even more likely. It does mean, in my estimation, that pan-regional Arctic governance is likely to weaken, and that this idea of Arctic exceptionalism or uniqueness is eroding, and it is unlikely to endure, I think, as this what we will look back upon as a kind of brief post-Cold War euphoria and optimism about the capacity for Arctic cooperation. So this is an argument that I developed more fully in a paper published in 2019 in the Arctic Yearbook, which for anybody who's interested is open access and available for you online if you would like to read a little bit more nuance to this argument. But I welcome your questions, and thanks very much for your time.
Well, thank you, Will. And just a quick note, I have a very barky dog loose in the house with me, so apologies if you hear any noises in the background. Thanks, Will. We have, and thank you, Doug, for really interesting set of papers or comments. We have a chat session, and it would be nice if we could field some questions. And I see we've got a couple that are starting to roll in. Let me ask you both a question first, and then I'm going to turn to the chat box and start fielding questions from the audience. We'll give them a chance to sign in and write their comments. But two things. First, I want to ask you, Doug, Atlantification and Pacific, yeah, yes, a metaphor. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that means from a scientific perspective? Will touched on these things are happening. What exactly is happening in that regard?
I think what you're asking is what may be some regional differences on the from a Canadian standpoint, the western part of your world versus the eastern part of your world, and where we are here in Alaska, we look west and northward almost exclusively. The Bering Sea, which we share primarily with Russia and some of Asia, and then north of the Bering Straits, the Chukchi and Beaufort Sea. Just quickly, that all the images that I presented and Will presented are like maps of change and what the current conditions are. But everyone, of course, understands that underneath those pictures are ocean currents and atmospheric currents, and frankly, the level that I work at as an environmental biologist is at far smaller scales. Okay, and this is the scales which most of you are experienced with as well as local people. So just to answer your question just quickly, there is two in the Arctic. It's the two aspects of looking at science and the environment. There's the scientific approach, and then there's the traditional knowledge. And what we're finding, before these were seen as being separate, what we're finding is that they, of course, are looking at the same environment in slightly different gazes, slightly different worldviews. And what we're finding is that depending on where you are, we're seeing different magnitudes of change and different types of change. In the Pacific, we are seeing the Pacific side, ocean currents changing, ice patterns changing in ways that are beyond traditional knowledge, and certainly beyond scientific knowledge, because there hasn't been that much work done. But in general, to answer your question, I think on a large scale, we are seeing essentially the absence of ice, warming of temperatures, increase of southern species, both marine and terrestrial. And some of these are having quite profound impacts. And in the marine environment, where we're seeing southern species of fish come into the Bering Sea and Arctic Ocean that not only are disrupting the ecological stability, but they're dragging with them a lot of commercial activities in fisheries. I'll just mention one other thing. For example, a really important part of the Arctic environment is pollinators. That is what causes the vegetation to renew itself, and with berries and many other things. The pollinators are changing, and so in some cases, it's having a profound effect on the actual, not only the coverage of vegetation, but the types of vegetation. Did I answer your question? Heather, you muted.
Yeah, I think, thank you. I think so. It's just interesting to understand what those metaphors might mean from an environmental perspective. Now, we have a question actually from the audience. I'm going to turn to a question from the audience from Katharina Koch. And I apologize, I hope I've pronounced that properly, who has a question for Will. And she says, apologies, I haven't read your paper yet, but I'm looking forward to it. Would you be able to elaborate a little bit more on the transition from pan-regional to sub-regional activity and behavior?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you very much for the question. So the way that this idea of Arctic security is in a very rough sense, but typically understood over the last couple of decades, is that during the Cold War, because obviously the Soviet Union and the United States were in this structural rivalry with each other and were unwilling to cooperate in a way that they feared would give the other side an advantage in that competition, that it wasn't possible to have Arctic regional cooperation per se. You could have piecemeal bits of it, but you could never have the region as a whole. And that dynamic changed at the end of the Cold War, when, of course, the Soviet collapse and American hegemony changed the structural dynamics and relationships between those countries. And first through the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy, and then afterwards the Arctic Council, we actually saw the emergence for the first time of these pan-regional Arctic institutions. And this idea that Arctic cooperation was not only possible, but was flourishing, and that now it would be possible to address many of the challenges and issues in the region, notably environmental issues, pollution, transboundary pollution, climate change, and so forth, that was happening because of American structural power and dominance, right? No one was challenging the United States. No one was trying to remove the United States from their position of global leadership. So it was possible under that broad umbrella of post-Cold War American power to have regional cooperation for the whole Arctic, and that a lot of political activity was taking place at that pan-regional level. But what I think has happened, and what I think has now kind of outstripped that understanding of post-Cold War Arctic security, is that the United States is I'm sorry to say, very clearly in relative decline, very accelerated relative decline because of its own missteps and strategic errors and poor leadership, and I could go on. And so what that's done is the United States, of course, remains very powerful and very important, but it's no longer able to set the agenda the way that it once did. And it's no longer the unipolar actor in global politics that no country is prepared to challenge. Very clearly, there are a number of countries in the world, including Russia, that have very effectively challenged the United States in various ways. But what we're seeing, and I think where my argument kind of kicks in there, is that we're not seeing a single structural factor like the relationship between the United States and Russia, for example, have even effects or have the same effects all over the Arctic region. What we're seeing is really a breakdown of the single Arctic into these subregions where very different kinds of political processes can be happening. And let me give you an example. So Russia is pivotal, of course, in the Arctic. Russia is so geographically large, has half of the Arctic population. It's simply, integral to the Arctic region as a whole. But in the context of what I'm calling this sub-regionalization, it's possible for, on the one hand, Canada and the United States to have quite conflictual and belligerent relationships with Russia in the North American Arctic. We've been seeing this in terms of going back to 2008, now quite old, in terms of this kind of ratcheting up of tensions and allegations of Russian buzzing North American airspace, and a lot of inaccurate information that was being distributed by the government of Canada at that time, and just a construction and a production of Russia as an antagonist, as an enemy, as, I hate to say it, somehow threatening Canada's Arctic sovereignty, that can be the dynamic of politics and security with respect to Russia that's happening in the North American Arctic. But simultaneously to that, you can have Canada and the United States as NATO allies, the Nordic countries, or most of them anyway, NATO allies and partners, have very cooperative relations with Russia in many respects in Northern Europe and the northwestern part of Russia, the Barents region, for instance. And that you don't have a kind of uniform or regional dimension to, pan-regional, dimension to Arctic politics and cooperation. You can have Russia be the bad guy over here for one set of Western states. You can have Russia be a necessary partner for another set of Western states over here. And then, of course, the dynamic between Russia and China in the Eurasian Arctic, which is just kind of separate and apart from those other two dynamics. It's its own regional dynamic being driven by the great power interests of two very important countries, China and Russia, that are pursuing their own national interests without particular regard for what it means for Arctic cooperation or the region as a whole, etc. So the level of the Arctic, capital T, capital A, stops being a very useful level of analysis, I suggest, for understanding those specific processes that are unfolding within the region at the same time.
Great. Thank you, Will. That was a wonderful answer. And the next question, I'm just going to say before, I have a question from Paul, and he's been waiting a bit, but before that, we may run over. We've got a couple of questions. We're slated to end in about 5 minutes. We have a few more questions, and I'm going to ask our panelists if they don't mind just to stay on and answer them, and we understand some of you may have to leave. But the next question is from Paul Mayer, and it is both, I think, for Doug and for Will too. But we'll start with Doug. How can Arctic issues get traction at COP26? What are the current arrangements for search and rescue in the Arctic? And are they keeping up with the increase in maritime traffic referenced in Doug's talk?
Oh, just quickly, they already are. And in the chat, I gave you a web link to the Arctic Domain Awareness Center, our website, and you can jump in there and see some of the activities we're helping organize. But like I said, and Paul, like you mentioned, Arctic issues really, for up until recently, were seen as being, this is my interpretation, of being slightly irrelevant to what everything else was happening in the world, and that has completely changed. So I don't think that it's going to take any extra urging on our part to get this to rise to be an important issue.
Will, do you want to talk to the search and rescue piece?
I was going to pick up on the COP piece for
Okay,
just a
that's
moment, if I could, which is I agree with Doug, and I certainly wouldn't suggest that the Arctic is not important for climate change negotiations. It of course is. It should be considered, but I would, I guess, add a dimension that, as we know, climate change is a global issue, and its relevance, the clear impacts that it's having globally are clearer all the time. And in that sense, I actually think it's going to be perhaps more difficult for Arctic specific issues to get traction going forward. I think there was a window of time, and I hate to say it, but around 2007, 2008, when if the Arctic per se and the radical transformation of the Arctic due to climate change was going to catalyze action, that's when it would have happened. The Arctic is peripheral. The Arctic is marginal to global politics. That doesn't mean it's unimportant. Of course it's important, and particularly from a climate perspective, its role in regulating the Earth's climate, it's incredibly important. But people around the world don't know much about the Arctic, and while they may care on some, kind of surface level or shallow affective level, they may care about what happens in the Arctic. They care much more about what happens close to home, and they care much more about where they live and how they are now being affected by climate change. So I do worry that actually, as climate change continues to accelerate, the Arctic will have greater and greater trouble finding a home on that agenda or finding a champion, because everybody's going to become increasingly preoccupied with climate change where they live. And there's only 4 million people in the circumpolar Arctic. And so how do you how do you reclaim that agenda now that that agenda has well and truly gone global?
Great. Thanks, Will. Okay, now we have another question, a couple more here. Aaron Edwards, and I may not have pronounced that properly, but a question for Doug. Do you think we're seeing environmental collapse or environmental transformation, or probably both? What do you see as the consequences for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous humans' presence in the Arctic?
Okay, so I answered Aaron directly on chat, but for the rest of you, it's very much transformation. Collapse really is not a term we use environmentally. That's more something, forgive me, Will, but that falls in your world, not mine. But whenever we're talking about environmental change, we haven't even talked about or frost change. This affects our Arctic communities, particularly those off the road system. And for those of you who are not, I think most of you understand that difference. Availability of water in the Arctic turns out to be one of the most critical issues. And when what's called the built infrastructure starts to be affected by environmental change, oh my gosh, in Alaska, and I know in far north Nunavut, we have people whose sewage is operated through a honey bucket, and you all understand what that is. But where do you put the sewage, and where do you get your water, and on and on. So the good news is that this is increasingly being addressed by a lot of different areas: engineering, biology, of course, social sciences. So nobody has all the right answers immediately yet, but it's now becoming more aware that this is a rapidly changing and transforming environment.
If I could just add to that, and I'll loop in the search and rescue and the emergency response piece to there as well. And I think Doug's point is well taken. I don't use the word collapse in a terribly scientific sense when I do, so no one should read too much into that. But what does attract my attention as a social scientist and as an analyst is to think about the vulnerability of particularly small and isolated Arctic communities, particularly those that may be off-road or only accessible by air or water. This idea of critical infrastructure is just that. This is critical, right? This is the infrastructure necessary to actually support settled human life in those places. And what we've seen as a result of climate change is the real vulnerability of some of those pieces of critical infrastructure to environmental change. So, permafrost thawing being a major one, coastal erosion being another. And that this, when your community is only accessible by air, having the airstrip out of commission is a pretty fundamental challenge to your viability, right? And your survival, your well-being, your ability to access food. When you rely upon diesel, fuel being imported, if the boats can't get to your harbor because it's blocked by, unseasonal ice or whatever, or the harbor has collapsed because of coastal erosion, really, really does challenge the viability of those communities in the short term and the people who live there. And so I don't use collapse in a kind of, scientific or structural way, but I think it helps to maybe think about the relative fragility of maintaining the existing modern form of life that many small isolated Arctic communities have in the face of insufficient resources from their governments from further south to help them adapt. And I think that kind of draws the attention to climate change, adaptation more so than mitigation, and the idea of community resilience. Communities can only be resilient in the face of climate change if they're adapting to climate change. And so through no fault of the community's own selves, I'm not trying to put the blame on them by any means. Many communities lack the resources and the capability necessary to be able to adapt effectively. In terms of search and rescue, I'll just touch on it very briefly, but I think that ties into this idea of collapse quite nicely, because what it poses is the prospect or the hypothetical possibility of a major outside shock to the existing equilibrium in both natural and social systems, right? So maybe you're okay right now. Maybe your community is resilient right now. Maybe you've managed to improve your infrastructure, or you've relocated inland, or maybe you're just fortunate and you haven't been terribly affected yet. But will that resilience be able to endure should there be a major marine disaster in your neck of the Arctic, right? Should there be an oil spill, should there be a pipeline rupture, should there be another natural or human-made disaster of some sort, a shock to the system that you operate and live within, I would suggest that most Arctic communities, again, through no fault of their own, but because of the relative vulnerability and the relative precarity of Arctic life in many places, are not equipped to effectively manage or indeed survive that kind of a major exogenous shock. So cooperating and building up interstate cooperation around things like search and rescue and emergency preparedness and response and oil spill preparedness particularly is extremely important, and has been a focus of activities at the Arctic Council level as well as the national and subnational level in recent years. And so the short answer to your question, I'm sorry, I forget who asked the question, is that there have been these Pan-Arctic agreements to try to coordinate search and rescue response and separately emergency preparedness response, in order to leverage the fact that sometimes your own country's Coast Guard or Navy or other capabilities are not the ones best positioned to respond to a disaster in a given region of the Arctic. And that having the Danes and the Canadians be able to cooperate in the archipelago is probably a really good idea. Having the Norwegians and the Russians be able to cooperate in the Barents, similarly, Canadians and Americans in the Beaufort, etc. And so there's an effort to kind of build up that greater cooperation and a framework to make that happen. But that's all trying to create a kind of safety net around the possibility of such a disaster occurring, rather than preventing the kinds of activities that at their root are likely to produce such a disaster in the first place.
Great, thank you both. And that really segues into what I think will be our last question, or in fact, it does answer our last question from Roy Culpepper, who wanted to know, who says that there's a need to protect communities and habitats from further warming. Could our speakers talk about adaptation or building resilience in the Arctic to cope with deteriorated climate? And so, Will, I think you segued into that very nicely, and I'm just perhaps going to ask Doug if he wants to make one last comment on that, and then I'm going to turn us back to Peggy.
Okay, thanks, Roy, for the question, and I gave a brief answer in the chat box, which people may want to look at. But just quickly, here in Alaska, and I know this is also the case in Northwest Territories and in Nunavut, because of melting permafrost, that the stability of community structures like houses people live in and water tanks and the rest are being greatly affected. The term that's used for all of this is the built infrastructure, the pipes, the houses, and the rest. And so the immediate response in both our countries is to either relocate or replace. And so you would move people to a safer place, and that is like in the town of Shishmaref here in Alaska, or you would your house fell apart, and so now we'll just build it. But replacing the same kind of a structure in a rapidly changing environment is a very short-term response. The good news is that engineering and some other fields are looking at reimagining, reconceptualizing what the built infrastructure should look like in the new changing environment. And so there's some very exciting developments being proposed that would create new living structures, new community support structures. Number one, that is economically feasible. Number two, is going to be stable in the rapidly transforming environment. Number three, actually uses some of the local indigenous knowledge about what works and what doesn't. And probably the most important thing is that to have built infrastructure that can be maintained by local people. And I will give you just one example of this. One of my colleagues, who is a mycologist, that is, they work with fungus, has developed a way to grow local Arctic fungus in a way that it can be used as insulation. So what we used to use as styrofoam, and that this is something that can be done by local people. It sounds funny to be growing mushrooms, but it's not the kind you eat. But they can be formed into not only an insulating factor, but it's waterproof as well. This is just one example. So we have a lot of work to do. The environment is changing, but using the same old ways isn't going to solve much. But the exciting thing is that there is some very new approaches to this.
Could I add just one quick follow-up thought to Adele's question? So I can't comment on the soils per se, that's completely outside of my wheelhouse, but I have given some thought to this argument that you see about how climate change will be good for the growing season and the growing range in northern Canada, and that you could see agricultural production increase and so on. And something that always drives me absolutely nuts about that argument is it just seems to be completely ahistorical about the way in which, for example, the agricultural basin of the Canadian prairies was opened up. What does it take to have an agriculturally productive region that is producing those commodities, those food products for export? I mean, in the case of the Canadian prairies, they built a railroad, created 3 new provinces, and imported millions of new migrants. You have to build a road network. How are you going to get these foodstuffs to market? You need roads and rail and ports. You need to actually have a physical economic infrastructure to support large-scale agriculture. So to me, the question about whether or not a warmer Arctic will be able to quite literally, produce more food or be more amenable to growing is only the tiniest and in some ways the least interesting aspect of what it would take to actually have agricultural production happening at higher latitudes. And I see, especially in light of Doug's point, I think well taken, that this is a moving target, right? Climate change is happening. So if you're building to one standard of resilience today, is it going to be sufficient for the climate change that is going to be occurring in 25 years' time? Well, from the perspective of agricultural production in northern Canada, it's a daunting, an absolutely daunting prospect to imagine any substantial agricultural production there ever making it to market, which is to say ever being useful. So I'm very, very skeptical of this prospect, and I've never really seen a good argument for it.
Thanks, Will. Doug, do you want to comment on that? We do actually have a question from Adele, and I've told we have time to answer it. So, and I know you had a bit in the chat, but the question is, and Will had just spoken to it as well. Many believe that forests will advance northward and farming will be enabled. Nevertheless, expert advice tells me this can only happen if the soil change if the soils change appropriately, and that's a much longer time scale. Please comment. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I just sent Adele another comment, but well, what a great question. And oh my gosh, have you asked a really complex question? And there is no quick and simple answer. I will just say two things. First is that in one sense, as the temperature is warm and the vegetation changes, it becomes that we're talking about an ecosystem change that does tend to change the abiotic environment like soils. I think if what you're asking is how will this affect the type of forest, can like agriculture be undertaken at a higher latitude? The answer is yes, but it's not going to be with agricultural plants or animals that are used in lower latitudes. And just one obvious example, that economic crops like rye and barley can be done in very high latitudes. We even have a farming community up here in Anchorage. But you're not. These are rather limited crops, and you're economically, and you're not going to be growing corn or wheat or anything like that. But a far more important question is that what we really want to do in terms of classic agriculture? There may be some very interesting other ways to be looking at what is a temporary, what can be done now, what can be done in the next 25 years. Great question, complex, and the answers to it are even more.
Well, thank you, Doug. And I have a quick question for our organizers, because we did receive one more question. I don't know that you're lining up to put another panel on, though. So I will defer. I got the message back. Yes, we do. We could take the one last question from Jackson Bellamy. Hello, Jackson. Jackson's a student at Trent. So Jackson is asking, how will Arctic resources and environment fare considering the cumulative impacts of climate change and Arctic activity? How should we rethink environmental security in the presence of these risks and changes? So I think this is a question for both of you. So Will, we'll start with you, and but this really is the last question. Sorry, everyone, but we do need to wrap up.
Yeah, well, you've given us such an easy question for the last one, Jackson. This is a big question, and I think it gets at really fundamental questions of our economic system and our societal values. I think the answer to your question, how will Arctic resources and the environment fare, considering the impacts of climate change, just frankly begs all kinds of other questions that are very difficult to answer. So it's a great question, it's a good question, it's a thesis question, but it's hard to say. I mean, I would suggest that the major driver of climate change, quite clearly in a broader sense, seems to be carbon-based consumption and carbon-based capitalism. To the extent that that is the system that has produced anthropogenic climate change, it seems certainly plausible to me that we will have a very difficult time effectively addressing the climate crisis within that economic and social paradigm. In the context of the Arctic, those kinds of questions are really compounded because there is a higher level of subsistence-based activities, a higher level of local-based, economic and food and agricultural subsistence in some cases, which might make those communities a little bit more able to kind of revert to a more locally based economy, but it really would still entail huge amounts of external support and frankly, a very broad social economic transition. And I think this idea of a transition, whether we call it decarbonization, whether we call it more kind of industrially focused Green New Deal policy, even the idea of greening capitalism, but doing it for real, like capitalism somehow managing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, not only current levels of emission, but aggregate emissions in the atmosphere. Those are the kinds of questions that would need to be answered, I think, in order to get a real handle on your question. I think in the absence of that kind of systemic change, are not going to address the problem, and we will all be continuing to live and work and try to survive in an increasingly hostile global context. I'm sorry to say.
Okay, just quickly. Thanks for the question, I'm going to copy that down for my next proposal to get funded. That was sarcasm. It's absolutely true. And but what you're asking, the direct answer is what people like Will and I say all the time: more research is needed. But let me tell you, to follow on what Will is talking about, there is some really interesting approaches being done in Nunavut. Again, with the isolated communities, addressing the issue of with climate change and the impact of long distance transport of pollutants, the incredible cost of moving supplies from the south up into the north, that there is new social networks being put together, like in trading networks is not really the right word, but rather than having airplanes fly from Ottawa to every single local community in Nunavut, instead there is more localized hub and spoke being put together, not only for transport of goods, but for information and other resources. So what the environmental transportation is causing a dramatic shift in the paradigms that we are using to solve, produce answers and solve the questions, if we can do that. And it's very much a dynamic process, and that's what I think is very optimistic.
Well, thank you both so much for wonderful presentations and for an equally, good discussion, which seems has gone on longer than the presentations, which I think is always the mark of a successful meeting. So thank you, Will. Thank you, Doug. Honored to have you both as colleagues. And I'm going to turn this meeting back over to Peggy. Is that correct? Over to you, Peggy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I just want to, of course, echo Heather's thanks to our speakers. And I want to thank you, our moderator. And I want to thank, of course, all the participants for the wonderful questions. And I want to remind you, and I see you can all look, Shannon has put it into the chat box, to remind you that our next session, panel 2, on a changing Arctic Northern perspectives, will take place on Tuesday, 9 February from 3 to 4 p.m. EST, and really emphasize this is an opportunity for us to hear from Northerners. And I really, it's a wonderful opportunity to hear directly from Northerners. Don't miss it. Thank you again, and a very good day to all of you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.